React 19 has a ton of new stuff, including a very interesting new hook, useOptimistic, which you can use to give your app that snappy feeling, even when the backend isn't that fast. So I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know about this hook, when and why you should use it, how to use it with transitions and actions, how to handle errors, integrating it with React Query, and even whether you should or shouldn't use it with a state manager. And along the way, we'll install React 19 in a Vite application, and we'll use a minimalistic CSS framework. So stick around all the way, and by the end, you'll know everything you need to know about this cool new useOptimistic hook and a bunch more. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create the main application that we're going to be working with. It's called useOpt, RQ, Pico, useOpt meaning useOptimistic, RQ for React Query, which we'll be using by the end of it, and then Pico for the Pico CSS framework that we're using. Of course, all of this code available to you in the GitHub link in the description right down below. Okay, so we've created that. Let me bring it up in VS Code. So useOptimistic has a lot to do with calling API services. So let's go and create a simple API server that handles to-dos in the local project, and then we'll use that as our backend. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an API server directory, and then I'll initialize that with a package.json. And to that project, I'm going to add Express to do the API serving, as well as cores. Cores are going to allow us to communicate from the client to the server without any kind of issues. All right, now that we got that going, let's go create a server MJS file. And I'll bring in Express and cores. Because it's MJS, I can use that import syntax, which is really nice. And the first thing we'll do is create our app. We'll use cores, and they'll also allow it to handle JSON posts by using express.json. Now I need to create some to-dos. So I'll just create those locally. And then on /API to-dos, I'll return those to-dos. All that's left at this point is to listen on port 8080. But I really want to be able to add a to-do as well. So let's add a post. Now that I've got my post, let's go and implement on that. To do that, I'll first look at the request body. All I really want out of there is the text. Then I create a new to-do with an ID and that text. And then I take that to-do and I push it onto the in-memory list of to-dos and then return the to-do. Pretty simple stuff, but I do want this to be slow. So let's put a timeout on that. So I'll take all that implementation, drop it into a set timeout, and then only run it after 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds has elapsed. Okay, looks good. Let's fire it up. To do that, I'm going to do node watch on that server MJS. That's right, watch is now built into nodes, so you don't actually have to bring in node mon or anything like that. You can just use node watch. And if I go over to my browser and then go to API to-dos on that 8080, then I get my JSON. So looks good. So now let's start building our app. I'm going to go over and start dealing with our CSS issues. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of their boilerplate CSS and just give ourselves a nice body with a margin. Next thing I'm going to do is bring in Pico CSS. You're not familiar with what Pico CSS is. It's one of many minimalistic CSS frameworks. What's a minimalistic CSS framework? Well, that's a framework that is minimalistic. You basically just put that CSS style sheet on your app, and then anytime you have inputs or buttons, they're just automatically styled with those styles. It's really nice. If you're looking for an incredibly easy way to handle CSS and get a good looking application, then a minimalistic CSS framework might be what you're looking for. So in order to bring that in, I'm just going to use a link tag, which I'll bring over into my index.html and then just drop into the head section. And all this link tag does is bring in that Pico CSS. In this case, I'm using a classless variant, which means that it will apply styling just to basic tags. It'll apply it to inputs and H1s and buttons and just make them look good, without actually having to specify any kind of CSS classing. And that's it. That's all of the CSS styling I'm going to do. Let me go over here. I'll get rid of my app CSS and look at my app.jsx file. Let's pare that down. I know I'm going to need useState, so let's just keep that around. And I'll just put up an H1 that says to-dos. All right, now let's go fire that up. To do that, in the main directory, I'm going to do pm dev. And there we go. We've got our to-dos and it looks great. It's got dark mode already enabled. It's just really nice. All right, now we have our basic app set up. We've got our CSS going. Let's go and connect that to our API server. To do that, I'm going to bring in a function, get to-dos. It's simply going to call that API to-dos and give us back that list of to-dos. Next, I'm going to create an add to-do function. This is just going to take the text string, and then we're going to post to that same endpoint, triggering that post code that we originally wrote. In this case, we probably don't care what the response is because once we've got a posted to-do, then we're going to go and do another get to-dos to just get the new list of to-dos. All right, let's go create some state in our app to hold our list of to-dos. Now let's go and render those to-dos into an unordered list. Of course, there's nothing there yet because we haven't actually fetched those to-dos. We need to call this get to-dos. So when would we call that? Well, let's use a use effect for that. Okay, we've used a use effect to go and get to-dos. You can actually see that Console Ninja has told us that we were actually making a request. That's kind of neat. Let's go and check it out. And there we go. There are our initial set of to-dos from our API server. Looking pretty good. Now we should go and add some UI that has the text field, and we can type in a text field and add a to-do. So the first thing we need to do is track that to-do text. So we'll create some new state for that called new to-do. Down below that on our list, let's create the input that just tracks that to-do. Let's hit save. And you can see, yeah, it's really nice. That's some cool minimalistic CSS framework right there. We've had to do very little. We're not using any kind of custom components at all. We're just putting in an input field and it looks really good. And it also handles all the interactions, so that's really good. All right, now that we're tracking the text here, let's go and add the ability to hit enter on that and then send that to the server. So the first thing we need to do is have a local function called add new to do that calls that add to do function that we have up here that makes the post. Then once we get some confirmation that that actually happened, we'll do set to-dos and we'll await get to-dos. So we'll get an updated to-do list and we'll reset the text to an empty string. Looks pretty good so far. Now we got to connect that to the input. To do that, we'll just look for an enter key. So if we get an enter key, then we'll add new to-do. Let's hit save, and this should work. Okay, so we hit enter, and then 3 seconds later, bang, this should work. And yeah, that's not great, right? From a customer perspective, I'm connecting with this backend server. It's taking a while. We expect optimistically that this should work. So that's where this useOptimistic comes into play. So we are actually going to kind of say that this worked before it actually worked. Let me show you how this is done. I'm going to upgrade us to 19. To do that, I'm going to add React at the release candidate and also React DOM at the release candidate. Now, this may change depending on when you see this video. If 19 is released and we have 20, then chances are you're just going to have 20 already. You don't have to do this, but let's just say right now that you don't have access to useOptimistic because you're not on 19. So here we go. All right, now I've upgraded to 19. Fire up our app again. And now I'm going to go bring in useOptimistic. Then down in our code, I'm going to invoke useOptimistic, and I'm going to give it the list of to-dos. That's going to give us back optimistic to-dos. Essentially, right now, it just means that it's going to pass through the reference to to-dos to optimistic to-dos, and we can just use that as our map. Then when we add new to-do, we're going to want to invoke set optimistic to-dos to say, okay, this is what the to-dos might look like if this succeeds. So to do that, we're going to call that set optimistic to-dos. It gets given the current state, or you can just give it the new state if you please. But in this case, I'm going to use the function-based version of this to set the optimistic to-dos with the current to-dos. And then I'm going to create a new to-do on the end of it. It's going to have a random ID. We don't really care at this point what that ID is. And then it's going to have the text, that new to-do. Okay, let's give it a try and see if this actually works. So this should show immediately. And it doesn't. Is there some clue over here in our console why that's the case? And there it is in the console. It tells us exactly what we did wrong. We haven't called that set optimistic updater inside of either an action or a transition. So why do you need to do that? Well, what is happening here is that React is saying, okay, in this temporary time between when you've done your update, requested an update, and when the request actually resolves and the update comes back, we want to go and give you that optimistic data. But how do we know when that time starts and ends? Well, there's two different ways you can do that. You could create a transition, and during the time of the transition, then you'd use the optimistic stuff. And then when the transition completes, then you'd go back to using the real data. The other way to do it is to use a form action, and anything done during the form action processing time is part of that optimistic update. So you get the optimistic stuff at the beginning, and then when it resolves that action, you'll get the real data. So let's try each one of these. Let's try the transition version first. So what we need to do is bring in useTransition, and then we'll invoke that down here. So useTransition gives us back a tuple. That tuple has is pending, whether the transition is pending or not, and then a way to invoke the transition, so start transition. So let's go start with that start transition. So to use that, instead of just calling add new to do here, we'll call start transition, and then we'll invoke the add new to do as part of that. So let's hit save. Now let's go over here, and again, should work immediately. And look at that, it does. We see 3 seconds later, the text field completes, and now we're back into the real data again. We were looking at the temporary optimistic data there for a little bit, and now we're looking at the real data. Cool. We can even go and disable our input field based on that is pending flag. How cool is that? Now there is one potential gotcha I want to make sure you're aware of. So if you look at the documentation for useTransition, down here, it's pretty specific about the fact that the function that you pass to the start transition must be synchronous, and that React immediately executes this function and creates this state, this context of the transition. And if you perform updates later, then you're not inside of that. So I'm not 100% clear as to why this works. Clearly, this first function is synchronous, but then after that, the add new to do is asynchronous. So why that's actually lumped into that transition, I'm not 100% sure. Now, that being said, let's move on to learn more about useOptimistic. Another thing you can do with useOptimistic is give it effectively a reducer function. So that's the second argument. This function takes the original state as well as some action. In this case, we'll just give it text, and then it'll go and create the optimistic state based on that. This kind of gives us a simplified add to do. So now the simplified add to do, we can just use to take the text, and there you go. So this simplified add to do is going to be the wrapper around this reducer function that we created that takes the state and the action and creates the new state based on that. Okay, let's try this out. And it does. We've got that disabling going on. That's really looking good. Okay, so before we talk about how to do this with actions, let's talk about how to handle errors. So go back here to our API server, which is running in watch mode. So if you make any changes, it'll automatically update. And here we're going to look to see, and if the body text isn't error, then we'll go and add that to do. If it is error, then we'll give this response of 400 and say that we failed to add the to do. Now, obviously, this is pretty simple, but it's to emulate the fact that like some requests optimistically won't work. So we need to figure out what's going to happen in that case. Okay, so let's go back over here and just try it out. See what happens if we put in error. Okay, so that blew up, and it blew up because we got a rejection. Why do we get a rejection? Well, if we look back over here at our add to do, then we saw that the response was not okay. And so we threw a new error, failed to add to do. So what we can do is simply just wrap this await in a try catch. And really we should add the get to do's as well. We'll console log out the error. And then in all cases, either success or failure, we'll set new to do to an empty string. All right, let's give it another try. Now, because we restarted the server, our in-memory alterations are gone. That's to be expected. Let's try this again. Error, and boom, a nice clean fallback. How cool was that? And of course, you have that try block in there, so you could go and put up a toast, for example, saying that there was an issue. Well, let's try a good one. And that works. Okay, now that we know how to use a transition for this, the other option was to use an action. So let's go take a look at that. So I'm going to replace our div with a form, and I'm going to say that our action is add new to do. Now, because we have a form, we can simply get rid of new to do. Goodbye. Because back over in here with add new to do, we're going to get form data. And that form data is going to give us our new to do. To do that, all we need to do is get the text, And we need to make sure that we have a name for that. Name is text. That looks pretty good. But we don't have a transition either. So we're going to need to get rid of all of that. We can get rid of our useTransition. And I think this should be good to go. Let's give it a try and see what happens. We'll see what happens. And seems to be looking good so far. Boom. Okay, blew up. Okay, well, what we did was we did a set new to do. I forgot to account for that. So we don't have a set new to do down here. So what would you do instead? Well, we'd probably reset the form. So let's go give ourselves a reference to the form. So to do that, we'll bring in useRef, and then down here, we'll create a form ref, and then we'll set our form ref to that form ref. And then in our finally block, instead of set new to do, we'll go and reset the current form. So see what happens actually did work, but let's give it another try. And there you go. Optimistic updating. So easy. But of course, we're no longer disabling that text field since we no longer have is disabled from start transition. So is there a way to get that back in this model? Well, sure. We can use useActionState. Look at us. Now we got multiple lines of hooks coming in. So cool. Okay, let's go back down here and we're going to wrap our add new to do in a useActionState. So we're going to give useActionState our existing add new to do action. And then from that, we're going to get the action state output, which actually we don't really care about. We're going to get a new action wrapped called add new to do with state, which is the output of this useActionState. And then we're going to get back our old friend is pending. So let's use this useAction with state as our new action. And then let's use is pending again. So back over here, we'll set disabled to is pending and let's see what happens. So we'll say we should disable and we blow up. So what's actually happening here? Well, what's happening here is that this get on form data is blowing up. Form data is null in this case. So what we can do is generate form data by just instantiating form data on that form. So that's going to create form data for us. Let's give this a try. One more try with form data. And we'll clear out our console. Now we're disabling. Things look good. Ah, beautiful. I love it. Okay, so now we know more about how to use this useOptimistic hook and how to do it with transitions and actions. But I know a lot of you love React Query, and React Query actually has kind of built in, but more actually just as a pattern, this optimistic updating feature. But it's not really built into React Query. So an interesting question comes up. Should you use useOptimistic with React Query? Well, let's just try it and see. So we'll go back over here into our terminal. We'll stop our server and then we'll add React Query. Okay, now we see that React Query is not compatible with React 19. That's not actually true. When folks see this pure dependency stuff, they immediately assume that that means that this is not compatible with React 19. How could they do this to us? How could React Query not be compatible with React 19? No! It's fine. It's fine. It just means that the pure dependency has yet to be updated in React Query, and React Query is just going to use whatever React that you give it. And in the case of React Query, React is going to be compatible between 18 and 19. It's fine. Okay, let's move on and try it out. So back over here on our main, we'll bring in query client and query client provider from React Query. We'll create ourselves a new query client, and then we'll wrap our app in the query client provider. And we're good to go. Now we can use query. So let's bring that in. And now the first thing we can do is get rid of our stuff around to-dos. So we no longer need the to-dos and the use effect because we're going to bring in use query. We're going to say that we have this to-dos data. We're going to give it a query key of to-dos. We're going to give it the query function, in this case, get to-dos, and we're going to give it an initial set of data, which would be empty. Now it's going to go off and make that call for us. That's the beauty of React Query and why folks love it so much. So let's actually see. Does this actually work? Well, in order to figure that out, we need to launch the server. So let's do that. And look at that. Boom. Okay, so we've got our to-dos. Now we know that after we've added a to-do, we actually go back and refetch that data. So we need to use this refetch wherever we would have called get to-dos, which is kind of right down here. So let's refetch. Okay, let's hit save. Try this again. Now with our queue. Boom. So easy, or at least on the query side of it is. We're still using add to do directly to do the mutation. Can we use React Query for that? Let's give it a try. All right, let's go back into our code and we can get rid of these two. That's nice. And let's bring in useMutation. And let's see, down below here, let's call useMutation. We'll give it that mutation function of add to do. We don't have our simplified add to do there, so let's go move that down. Okay, good. Got our simplified add to do. When we are successful, then we want to refetch. That looks good. And we're going to take the async version of mutate as opposed to just mutate and call that our add to do mutation. We want the async version because that's going to give us back a promise so we can await that. All right, let's go down here and we'll just await adding that new to do. And because we've got the on success refetch, then we don't need to do that refetch ourselves. I think this might work. All right, let's hit save. Now with mutation. And there we go. Interesting. Okay. So what's happening there? Oh, I see. We're doing a simplified add to do up here. So let's get rid of that because this guy is already doing his simplified add to do on mutate. All right, let's hit save. Now just the once. Nice. Okay, awesome. All right, one more thing about useOptimistic is whether you should use it or not with a state manager. So we're going to take a look at a very popular state manager, Zustand, and re-implement this project with it and see if you actually need it to do optimistic mutation. And we're going to create the second project in here. We'll call it Zustand versus useOptimistic. Then I'll bring it up in VS Code. All right, over my other terminal, I'm going to get rid of my API server and my server, just so we know that we're looking at the same thing. Okay. All right, now in my API server directory, I'm going to do that server MJS. Looking pretty good. And let's see. So in my main directory, I'm going to do another pm install. Good. And I'm going to add Zustand. All right, let's bring up our server. And I'm actually going to just replace the entire implementation here and walk you through it. So up at the top, instead of having all of those hooks, we now just have create from Zustand. That's going to allow us to create our custom use to-dos hook. We have the exact same get to-dos and add to-do as we had before, but now we're creating our use to-dos hook, which is going to have everything we need in it. It's going to have our to-dos, which is an empty array. It's going to have our is pending, which we can use to disable or enable that text field. It's going to have an ability to get to-dos by calling that get to-dos function, and it's going to have the important post to-do. Now, post to-do is where all of the fun stuff happens. First, we're going to cache off the initial to-dos set. Then we're going to create the optimistic update. We're going to use set to do that. So we're going to set is pending to true in there, but we're also going to update to-dos with this new optimistic array, just like we did before, where we're creating a random ID and then the text. And then we're going to call our API service. So we're going to do a try catch around our add to do, as well as our awaiting of the get to-dos once it's finished. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to set that pending to false and return the original array of to-dos back. To kick this all off, we call getState on useTodos to get the current store, and then we call that getTodos function to get it all going. This is in replacement for a use effect. You could use a use effect to do this if you want. I'm just doing that at the top level of the module, whichever way you want to do it. Then down our app, we simply get useTodos. We get back is pending, to-dos, and post to-do. Then we're going to get that list of to-dos, which is either optimistic or not, depending on the status. And then we have our text field that calls that post to-do. Let's hit save and give it a try. Okay, looks like we're pretty good. There we go, got our optimistic update. And there it is. So when it comes to state managers and useOptimistic, I would say, well, if the state that you're dealing with, that you want to do optimistic updates on, is in the state manager already, then you should use the state manager for your optimistic updates instead of using useOptimistic. But if you don't, then you could use useOptimistic when you're using basic React hooks. Okay, there you have it. An in-depth look at all things useOptimistic. I hope I've covered a lot of your questions, but if I haven't, then be sure to put that in the comment section right and down below, and I'll try to answer that to the best of my abilities. In the meantime, of course, if you're interested in advanced topics like this, be sure to head over to pronextjs.dev. That's my professional Next.js development course. It is coming out very soon. There are 2 free tutorials, one on state management and one on forms management that you can get access to today by signing up on the newsletter. And of course, once you're signed up, you'll be notified when the course is available for purchase. Super exciting. In the meantime, if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.